The Indian Act of 1876 centralized control over Indigenous people, defining their legal status and governance, and had a lasting impact on Indigenous autonomy and culture in Canada. Before 1876, the Canadian government aimed to assimilate Indigenous people, putting pressure on them to give up their lands and adopt Western customs, disrupting traditional governance and cultural practices. The Act established rules for reserve land management, Indian status definitions, and band governance, and gave the federal government extensive control over Indigenous communities. The Act restricted cultural and spiritual practices, including banning traditional ceremonies and enforcing residential schooling to assimilate Indigenous children. It disrupted traditional social structures and practices, leading to long-term consequences for Indigenous communities.
Introduction to residential schools and their connection to the Indian Act. Residential schools mandated by amendments to the Indian Act aimed to assimilate Indigenous children. Specific amendments enforcing residential schooling. Amendments in the late 19th and early 20th centuries made attendance at these schools compulsory. Personal stories and testimonies from survivors. Survivors of residential schools recount their experiences of cultural loss and abuse.
Used to beat up the other.
Long-term effects on Indigenous families and culture. The legacy of residential schools includes intergenerational trauma and loss of cultural identity.
The concept of enfranchisement was enforced on many First Nations peoples. Enfranchisement is the removal of Indian status from an individual, as well as their name from their banned list, with the goal of having them assimilate into Canadian culture and society. This resulted in loss of benefits associated with Indian status such as healthcare and tax exemptions. Though enfranchisement was introduced as early as 1857, it was voluntary and many First Nations peoples did not want to give up their way of living. However, with the enactment of the Indian Act in 1876, there were many conditions introduced where Indian status could be revoked, such as pursuing a degree or career as a doctor or lawyer, or for males, wanting to be able to vote in elections. Women faced much more discrimination towards retaining Indian status, losing her status if she married a non-native man and being unable to pass her status on to her children. In the case of Catherine Fournier, her grandfather Maurice Sanderson, member of the Pinemudang First Nation in Manitoba, underwent voluntary enfranchisement in order to own property and vote. In 1985, due to changes in the Indian Act and the abolishment of enfranchisement, Catherine and her mother were able to regain their Indian status, but Catherine was unable to pass her status down to her children due to restrictions enacted in the Act, which is still in place today. Fournier wishes for her children to carry on their Indigenous identity and culture in an official way. Many Indigenous people wish to carry on their heritage and have it recognized, due to decades of the Canadian government attempting to take that away. Despite the enactment of Bill S3 to eliminate gender-based discrimination in the Indian Act, there are still cases where descendants of women who lose status due to enfranchised husbands are unable to reclaim their status. However, legislation like Bill C-38, which was proposed as recently as 2022, attempts to address these issues. It is clear that the effects of the enfranchisement process still have profound effects on Indigenous peoples today.
Bill C-31 was created in order to update the Indian Act, which was supposed to modify the Act to be more reflective of the current Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms. This new change would rewrite the Act so that a woman's status would still be upheld even if marrying someone with no Indigenous background. Originally, the Indian Act was more gender-dependent when it came to marrying non-Indigenous individuals. Women would lose their status if marrying a non-Indigenous man, where this wouldn't be the case for an Indigenous man marrying a non-Indigenous woman. Bill C-31 changed this so that a woman could keep her status even if marrying a non-Indigenous man. The original Indian Act, of course, is discriminatory to women, who don't get the same rights to their status as men do. Indigenous women have had less rights, despite Canada's laws at the time improving for non-Indigenous women. After the bill came out, women who have previously lost their status from marriage have regained status, as well as their children also gained Indian status. Gender was no longer dependent on Indian status, making the act more gender equal.
Indian Act Bill S3, passed in 2017. Bill S3 was a historic change designed to prohibit discrimination against Indigenous peoples based on their gender when registering for citizenship. By amending the Indian Act, this law guarantees that all Indigenous people, regardless of gender, have equal access to benefits and registration. Its main goals are to promote fairness and correct historical injustices. Bill S3 contains significant changes such as eliminating restrictions that discriminate against women, giving formerly de-enfranchised people their status back, and broadening the qualifying requirements for registration. These adjustments guarantee that everyone is treated equally and right historical wrongs. Before Bill S3, marriage was one way for Indigenous women to lose their status. Among other serious disadvantages, the measure promotes gender equality in registration rights and permits women who lost status to reclaim it to overcome these disparities. Bill S3 is making progress, but there are still obstacles to overcome, like insufficient knowledge among impacted parties and bureaucratic holdup. Concerns over the speed and efficacy of the reforms are voiced by several populations. To fully reap the benefits of the measure, activism and support must continue.